Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce's Ukraine War news update for the 5th of July 2023. Let's go to where we normally start, the Ukraine General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. These might be somewhat exaggerated. I'm finding these to be indicatively very useful to understand the trends of the day before, and there is a lot of information to suggest that these are accurate, a lot of evidence to support the claim. 670 liquidated personnel. That's the one that's more difficult to find out the degree of accuracy there, because those, I think there's going to be a lot of guesstimation going on with regard to strikes on certain targets to think how many people have been taken out, whether that includes, whether that's definitely dead, or casualties that won't be rejoining the war anytime soon, so on and so forth. But nonetheless, that is round about where it's been for the last few days, for the last week or so. There have been some spikes to the 1,000 mark, but it's more commonly around the 600 to 700, sometimes 500. 3 tanks, 9 APVs. That is, again, pretty much what it's been for the last few days at least. And then we have another massive day for artillery losses for the Russians. 36 tubed artillery systems being lost. 9 multiple launch rocket systems, 9 MLRS, Grads, Smerchets, that kind of stuff. Just a really, really heavy set of heavy losses there. Just absolutely critical, I think, for the Russians. They must be getting to a really problematic point with regard to what their capacity is for launching artillery barrages or hitting Ukrainian positions with artillery. And I've seen an awful lot of video footage to support these kinds of figures. Now, you're not going to see 36 artillery systems taken out on video camera, and that's not going to be the case. But there's a lot, and there's a lot of MLRS systems that I've seen here as well. 1 anti-aircraft warfare system, not sure what that is, 12 drones, 22 vehicles and fuel tanks, and 8 pieces of special equipment. So those are 2 high numbers there in those 2 categories. Vehicles and fuel tanks, we've seen all sorts of vehicles get hit behind enemy lines. That's obviously a wide category. But we have seen the Ukrainians purposefully hammer the Russian logistic lines. It's getting artillery and supplies to the front line, hitting those, as well as the logistics routes themselves, like railway lines and so on and so forth. 8 pieces of special equipment, that's a wide remit for that category, but 8 is definitely very high. We are seeing less than now it's just over 1 a day. It was less than 1 a day, and then the counteroffensive started happening, and we saw these numbers ramp up. It's now over 1 a day, but it's still less than 2 a day. And to lose 8 pieces of special equipment is obviously fairly significant. That'll be hitting more often than not, I think, things like ISR points, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, video cameras put on pylons, that kind of stuff. So I think this is another successful day for the Ukrainians. I was talking about yesterday, going through a post talking about the success of the counter offensive, as according to one analyst, and we're going through how actually, all things considered, and without air support, things are going well for the Ukrainians. In fact, Thomas Tyner's done a big thread yesterday that says pretty much the same thing, and I'll share that with you in my extra video today. Although I don't know if I'm definitely doing an extra video, I might well be doing an interview with a medic trainer from a global augmentation. So we'll see about that. I'll let you know. Anyway, going to look at supporting evidence. Alexander Syrsky, commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, voiced confidence that Ukraine will be able to retake Bakhmut. He said that Russia is suffering 8 to 10 times as many losses as Ukraine across the battlefield. According to General Tarnavsky, who commands the troops in the south, the situation is stable, but Ukrainian forces haven't reached their full potential, and a lot of this will revolve around them not yet using their main forces down in the south. Ukrainian commander said that the counteroffensive is developing according to the plan, but the military has not yet deployed its full potential. Okay, what else? Some decent context to the state of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Financial Times analysis by the UK Chief of Defence Staff Admiral Tony Radakin. Russia has lost half of its combat capability in Ukraine, says the UK Armed Forces chief. I mean, that is huge, right? So here's the start of the piece. Russia has suffered major losses. The Ukrainians are stringing the Russians out over a massive area, trying to create weak points. People talking about the counteroffensive being a failure are out of their minds. So let's just dip into this. The Russian army has lost half of its combat effectiveness in Ukraine, including as many 2,500 tanks. The main push of Kyiv's counteroffensive is still to come, the head of British Armed Forces said. Admiral Tony Radakin rejected suggestions that Ukraine's counteroffensive was proceeding slowly, arguing that the pushback against Russia was never a singular act, and that Kyiv's military strategy to starve, stretch, and strike was gradually breaking down Russian defensive lines. Ukraine has struggled to puncture Russia's heavily fortified defences in the counterattack launched a month ago, deflating hopes that some of Kyiv's Western allies that Ukraine's armed forces would achieve a rapid breakthrough. Quote, the question is, how do you take a front line that is more than 1,000 kilometers long and turn it into more of a problem for Russia than for Ukraine? Radakin told a parliamentary hearing. That is why you are seeing multiple axes being probed and feints by Ukraine. And then to continue, another important nugget of the piece, the UK is still calculating that Russian production can only make up a small percentage of losses. Russian tank production is around 200 units per year. This is a really important figure, as pre-war production was estimated about the same. Quote, Russia is now so weak that it does not have the strength for its own counteroffensive. Russia has lost nearly half the combat effectiveness of its army. Last year, it fired 10 million artillery shells, but at best can produce 1 million shells a year. It has lost 2,500 tanks and at best can produce 200 new tanks a year. So that asymmetry is massively impactful. The UK is the second largest provider of military aid to Ukraine after the US, and has been at the vanguard in terms of providing Kyiv with advanced military equipment, including main battle tanks and long-range cruise missiles. So that is very interesting to hear. Another Su-35, that's like the Russians' best plane, has been shot down, apparently. That plane is Russia's most modern junk, says Thomas Tyner, and yet it will always turn into a fireball when it comes up against 20-year-old PAC-2 from a Patriot missile system. The implication is it's Patriot that took that down. Outside of Bakhmut in Zaitseve and Bakhmutska, Donetsk Oblast, Ukrainian forces from the 43rd Artillery Brigade conducted effective counter-battery fire, destroying a Russian 2S-1 Grozdika, a BM-21 Grads, that's a multiple launch rocket system, and 2S-5 Janssen S with drone-spotted HIMARS fire. And why I've included this is we are seeing continued use of HIMARS to take out individual targets, individual pieces of artillery and equipment. So HIMARS are doing, I guess, what they were designed to do, which is to replace artillery, tubed artillery generally, and to use fewer shells, if you like, fewer pieces of ordnance to do the job. And here it is taken out. Here HIMARS are taking out those kinds of targets. Ukrainian forces continue to conduct highly effective drone-spotted HIMARS counter-battery fire on Russian artillery units. So here's another montage. Seen here destroying 4 BM-21 Grads, 1 2A-65 Mr. B self-propelled howitzer, an associated tow vehicle, and 1 2S-7 Pion SPC. So there is plenty of footage of all sorts of targets being hit. Russians are taking a battering in terms of losing equipment right along the front line. I mean, this is the case around Bakhmut as well as it is down in Zaporizhia. They have lost. So I think that here, yeah, it's this one. So Ukrainian gunners destroyed 3 Russian multiple launch rocket systems in the Bakhmut sector. And in fact, reporting from Ukraine, this video was on HIMARS strikes on these systems around Bakhmut, saying that yesterday, or the implication was yesterday, Ukrainians took out 9 pieces of artillery, including multiple launch rocket systems, around Bakhmut alone. Now, it's just Bakhmut, the town. And you then put that up and down the front line, and you start making sense of these figures of 36 being lost. So that's a quarter of them being lost in Bakhmut alone. Anyway, to continue, a Ukrainian AS-90 155mm self-propelled howitzer. So these ones given by the British, we've given about 33 of them, I think, was destroyed by Russian forces north of Mali-Shebaki. So that is in the kind of just to the west of Orikhiv. I don't know if that's on the way to Pietichaki, but that kind of area. This is a first confirmed loss of its type, a total of 32, sorry, not 33, donated by the UK. This has left a massive crater. You can see that there was obviously a catastrophic explosion of the vehicle here, leaving quite a hole. So that'll be the cooking off of the munitions inside, one would assume. Yeah, huge hole left by that bad boy. So that is obviously a big loss or a loss for the Ukrainians. I mean, it is one piece of artillery, so you know it's understanding that in context. It's always a shame when you see pieces that have been donated, but all pieces are it's all artillery, it's all equipment, and the Ukrainians need to lose far less than the Russians are losing. And it seems like that is statistically what is taking place, as we can see from things like Oryx, as I've shared with you over the last week or so. The Russians are losing considerably more. Anyway, Russia shells Sumy Oblast 268 times in a day. Russian forces shelled 10 communities in Sumy. So this is in the north of Ukraine across the border, causing 268 explosions along the border, according to a Facebook update from the Sumy Oblast military administration. They are shelling other places as well. So it could be that the Ukrainians need to be targeting Russian pieces of equipment within the Russian borders as well. This is where it gets ridiculous, where you're like, yeah, you can use our munitions to execute your defensive war, but you're not allowed to shoot into Russia, even though Russia are shooting from Russia into Ukraine. It is ridiculous. Yeah, you can only shoot them if they're. It's like, imagine someone trying to attack, throwing bottles at your house, right? And it's like, or attacking your house, and you say you can only do anything to them if they're literally on your property. If they're throwing stuff at you from the road, yeah, you're not allowed to do anything. Sorry about that. Like, yeah, ridiculous. Here's another Russia on fire. This is in Kazan, where massive blaze in the industrial sector of the Volga area on the banks of the Great River is spreading to other warehouses. So big old fire there in Russia. And in fact, this one, yesterday's fire at the Luzk thermal power plant in Veliki Novgorod. This is a really serious fire at a power plant. You can imagine that may have some pretty big consequences for Russian power production, and so on and so forth. And then some more relay boxes on fire. Talked about this the other day. Talked about how it can be quite complicated to get these things replaced. Depends on the wiring in them, whether you have the wiring diagrams, so on and so forth. But this is near Engels Air Force Base. This is an easy partisan activity, really. Setting fire to relay boxes is not. It's not difficult. It doesn't take massive amount of resources and time to sort out. So that's something that's quite easily achievable, but which might have fairly significant consequences, especially if you're doing that in a lot of places. Right. Moving on to missile hits and aerial strikes. Air Force of Ukraine has announced that 26 drones were shot down over Ukraine over the past day. So this came out last night. A lot of aerial threat from Shaheeds and whatnot, attack drones during the daytime yesterday. Ukrainian forces destroyed 20 attack drones and 6 reconnaissance drones over the past day. And then we have, this is massive, right? So this is occupied Donetsk city. There's a massive explosion in pretty much the heart. Well, I don't know if it's the heart of the city. This is a residential area where there's a block that's kind of set apart from all the other blocks, and in the middle of the blocks, you'll see in a minute, there was a whole bunch of ammunition, and it was spotted by the Ukrainians, and then detonate, and then struck with whatever. I think maybe HIMARS is a claim, but this is a huge explosion.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
So that caused windows and all sorts to be blown out. is really significant. And now video footage come out this morning, spectacular drone footage of the Russian ammunition depot, which got eliminated yesterday night. You can clearly see the missiles of the MLRS, and the amount of them is breathtaking. To store such ammunition in the center of Makivka, Donetsk, just paraphrases how little regard the Russian occupation has for the civilians. Russia brought total destruction to the people in Donbass since 2014, and this footage is another evidence of the fact. Basically, if you live anywhere near where the Russians are piling ammunition, you've just got to move. Luckily, this block, I don't know if people are living in there, but it's set quite far away from a lot of other establishments there. But this is big. So here is the aerial footage, and you can see just the way this is stored as well. They're just dumped. There's a whole load of MLRS ammunition dumped out in the open, easy to spot. Also, can easily corrode. Just it's not great, is it? But this appears to be the Russian way of doing things. There's a huge amount of ammunition piled up in the middle of this block of flats, or apartment complex. Then that is destroyed at night, and it is catastrophic. You can see it all cook off eventually. So the initial hits starts cooking off. Don't know, this is all silent. There's no sound on this. And yeah, it cooks off a lot, but you can see even when it's cooking off, areas around here are in danger of being hit. And then when a big explosion takes place, you can see the electricity surge. So that huge explosion causes electricity surges all around. So people are losing their power around here. And that is a massive explosion. Just absolutely phenomenal. And that is Ukraine hammering Russian logistics again, in this case ammunition for MLRS. Another video, the explosion temporarily occupied Makivka, Donetsk, from different sort of angles. That was caught on quite a bit of camera footage. That just hearing it, Chaplinka has been attacked, so that's kind of between the Dnipro River and Crimea, where the Russians set up an airbase once Chervono-Bivka was hit, and then eventually lost in the Kherson withdrawal. That was where they had an air base on the other side of Dnipro, the Russians. Then they moved their airbase to Chaplinka, but Chaplinka could get hit, and then they eventually moved everything kind of back to Jankoy in northern Crimea. But Chaplinka is somewhere that is quite often hit. So the village in the South Kherson region, just over 15 kilometers from the Crimean border, explosions were heard far beyond the village. And then explosion reported in the center of Sevastopol as well. And then it's reported that warehouse was struck by the Ukrainians in occupied Yakimivka in Zaporizhia region. The town is a logistical railway hub between Crimea and Melitopol, subject to strikes previously. So we have Chaplinka there. We've got Sevastopol at the bottom of Crimea. We've got Yakimivka on the way to Melitopol, and no doubt many other places as well. Also, yesterday we saw parts of a Storm Shadow cruise missile either shot down or brought down in some way, because actually it looks fairly intact. This is the first time. I mean, there have been parts of a Storm Shadow and claims that one was shot down the other day, but it might have actually been targeting an air defense system where they were recording from. But this looks like, most of the missile has actually come down. That the Russians will be, I guess, happy about that. But it's evidence that obviously Storm Shadows are being used widely on the night. So moving on to other bits and pieces, this is what is worrying an awful lot of people, and for very good reason, because, hey, nuclear. So on the night of July the 5th, and, fun fact, it's July the 5th today. On the night of July the 5th, Ukraine intends to hit the nuclear power plant with a Tochka-U missile with a warhead filled with nuclear waste, claims Rosatom, the Russian nuclear agency. So this is the claim of the Russians that the Ukrainians are going to hit the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant tonight. And the Ukrainians are saying this is clearly a false flag operation in the making. Russians have installed explosive-like objects on the roof of the nuclear power plant to imitate Ukrainian strikes. Apparently, their detonation should not damage power units, but could create a picture of shelling from Ukraine, says the General Staff of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Armed Forces, reporting on possible provocation. And then the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Dmitry Kuleba, is confident that the Russian leadership has received a number of warnings from world countries, including those that are not allies of Ukraine, about the inadmissibility of nuclear blackmail. This forced the Russian authorities to change their previous plans for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, although it is not guaranteed that they will not invent new ones. The head of the MFA emphasized that the most important, that's Ministry of Foreign Affairs thing, that has been done is that Ukraine brought the Russians' plan to the world, which will make it more difficult for them to implement it. Quote, I think that they are already rewriting it, inventing some new plan. I'm no less convinced that our intelligence will get it, and we will also bring it out to the public. He is sure that Ukraine actually thwarted the plan of the Russian Federation by voicing it. So the Ukrainians are talking a lot about this. They're talking about how the Russians have mined the nuclear power plant inside with explosives now on top to simulate a Ukrainian strike. And then the Russians are themselves claiming that the Ukrainians are going to strike it tonight. So we'll watch out for that, obviously. The General Staff are reporting that possible cholera outbreaks are taking place in occupied cities of Kherson Oblast. An increased number of intestinal infections, possibly cholera, have been noted in occupied Skadovsk, Henichesk, in the Kherson Oblast. The Russian-installed occupation authorities do not recognize the issues, trying to hide worsening sanitary situation in the oblast, the report said. The General Staff, however, noted that the occupiers and their families are secretly receiving cholera vaccinations. So that builds on claims that, in fact, we have seen cholera outbreaks previously over the last few weeks, and indeed there are talks about it in Crimea. There's some claims about it in Odessa possibly as well. Prigozhin has received back the money found during searches in his office in St. Petersburg. As Professor Gerdes was saying on my live stream the other day, it'd be nice to find this down the back of your sofa. The Russian newspaper Fontanka reports that the law enforcers initially had no intention of returning the money they found. 10 billion rubles. That is $111 million just found in his property. Hundreds of thousands of dollars and 5 bars of gold. However, according to the source, a force majeure circumstance intervened. According to preliminary reports, Prigozhin was in Moscow that weekend attending some meetings. Instead of the owner of Wagner PMC, his driver arrived to pick up the billions with an official power of attorney. Did it look like it was Putin's personal order? I suppose Prigozhin might have some compromising information about Putin, since after an armed mutiny he gets away with it and gets his money back. Will he use it to sponsor his next rebellion? Who knows if Prigozhin actually has compromise on Putin? That would be interesting. So one of the theories about Litvinenko dying is that he was at the time writing about Putin's sexual proclivities and was sort of outing some of Putin's more nefarious desires. And that's why he was killed, or part of the reason he was killed in the UK back in 2016, I think it was, or was it 2006? It might have been even that long ago. Actually, I think it's 2006. So, yeah, there could be compromise on Putin. You just don't know. And Prigozhin might well have it. Right, moving to military aid. Here we have the Bodana, which is the Ukrainian 155mm self-propelled gun. 2S-22 Bodana in service with the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Why this is significant is because actually, well, previously there was only one of these in existence, a prototype, but there are claims that the Ukrainians are now making it. So this would be great if they can indigenously produce self-propelled howitzers that have a decent enough range, comparable to something like the Caesar here. That'd be good news for the Ukrainians, and they are using that on the front line. So good stuff. Bulgarian minister, new military aid package for Ukraine is taking shape. Bulgaria has already begun preparing a new package of military aid for Ukraine, says the defense minister. Now, apparently, there is going to be a visit by Zelensky to Ukraine. So that's upcoming in the next 5 or 6 days. I think he's going to be visiting Bulgaria. Although quite often when these things come out in the open, the Ukrainians go, "Well, we didn't want that out in the open, so we'll have to change our itinerary now and dates and whatnot." So we'll wait. As someone says here, Bulgaria is the key partner for getting Soviet type ammunition to Ukraine, hopefully producing at full speed right now and getting all the EU funding needed. Bulgaria is indeed key. At one stage at the beginning of the war, news has subsequently come out to suggest that Bulgaria were providing, what was it, a third of all of Ukrainian ammunition themselves, something like that. A huge amount of assistance from Bulgaria because they have the ability to manufacture Soviet era uh, ammunition, particularly, and shells and whatnot. So I think it's the Arsenal manufacturing company or organization. Indeed, the FSB uh, during the war, since February 2022, has hit one of the arsenals. They sabotaged the plants. I think at least twice, as far as I can remember, like explosions at the plant in Bulgaria. So the FSB has been involved in Bulgaria trying to do that kind of activity. Our first apparent look at US supplied JDAM ER. So these are extended range JDAM bombs. These are the ones that apparently have been these are dumb bombs that have satellite guided capability attached to them, and there are some claims that they've been jammed quite easily, or they have been successfully jammed by the Russians. But nonetheless, here we are seeing them. We have seen some footage to suggest successful use of these recently. These, if they weren't being jammed, right, these would be, I'm sure, being used far more. They are just what the Ukrainians would want to hammer Russian forces along the front line, take out trench networks and all sorts. So it would be great if we start seeing a proliferation of these on the front line, these being used in greater numbers successfully. Chief of Defensive Staff, presumably going off of Defense Intelligence Assessment here, quote, Russia at best can produce 200 new tanks a year, helps put some of the wilder claims about Russia's defense industrial output in proper perspective. This is something I'm going to return to in my extra if I do it this afternoon. I've already recorded a part which looks at pro-Russian claim about their manufacturing facilities being put not quite on a war footing, but almost there, with certain ones I reported the other day only making tanks and only doing this and not doing all that. So they're organizing these, and the claims are that they can make, or at least some of the pro-Russian claims are that they can pump out a bunch of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and whatnot. I think a lot of what I was reading from this pro-Russian was kind of wishful thinking, like they could produce this, and if they do it at this rate, so yeah, but are they doing it at that rate? Can they do them at that rate? And so, well, we've got evidence that they are building helicopters for Africa, and they've got, and then when actually you look at the details, like, yeah, actually, some of those were more commercial helicopters they might have had in storage. The ones that have been given are ones they've got shed loads of, like Me-24s, and there's only 3 of them being given, and actually that one that was given to, say, Uganda was as a result of a facility being built in Africa that would have been like years in the making to refurbish existing Me helicopters there. So it's not like Russia. So it's like unpicking some of these claims and saying, so does it look like Russia has if they are sending helicopters to Africa, does it mean they are producing loads of helicopters and they have loads spare? No, in fact, it's much more nuanced than that. But anyway, you can watch that later. But the idea here is that even if they could produce 200 new tanks a year, that is not enough to overcome the losses, the considerable losses they are making. Now, on the same kind of line of thinking, here we have in the Voronezh region a column of T-54 and 55 tanks. If they could produce enough tanks, they wouldn't be dusting off these old tanks here, which they appear to be doing, and that suggests that actually they're in a pretty desperate predicament. And they need to get hold of basically anything they can. There's some more footage here from Belarus. I'm not sure how many pieces of equipment here. I mean, you only see 3 on this train in this bit of footage. I don't know whether these are brand new, whether these are refurbished, or whether these are just existing stock that are being moved from A to B. But there are basically 3 bits of kit here. You can see, like, just to the left of this one, uh, as it flips back to the beginning, there's a carriage. So there aren't more to the left unless there's carriages and then some more later on. And from the right, it looks like the engine is here next. So that's the engine shunting. So this could just be 3 bits of kit in Belarus, in which case, yeah, kind of so what. So we must be careful to try and get an accurate understanding of what's going on with regards to particularly Russian equipment being sent to the front line. This is Hannah. So moving on to Frontline now. There was a lot of rumor yesterday that quite a lot of success took place for the Ukrainians. It's still kind of filtering through, and you're never quite sure operational security exactly what has happened. But it looks like there's been success around Bakhmut. It looks like there's been success on the Zaporizhia front line as well. So here, Hannah Malyar says, we advance on the southern flank around Bakhmut. Fighting in the north continues. Inside Bakhmut, it's difficult for the enemy. So that's saying all 3 areas of Bakhmut, north, south, and in the city, the Ukrainians are seeming to be making progress in different ways, possibly. At the same time, Russia tries to advance in Liman, Avdiivka, and Mariinka, but they fail. So this is saying that the Russians are on the offensive in certain areas. We have progress in the south. Not really very detailed, quite vague. There are claims. So here's a claim that Russia is actively using chemical weapons against our forces in the Bakhmut region. Spokesman for the forces of the Tavria region, Oleksiy Dimitroshkivsky, said, quote, during artillery fire, an element called lewisite is used. They are already victims of the chemical element. Its symptoms are nausea, vomiting, and loss of consciousness. He added, the use of lewisite as a chemical weapon was prohibited by the Chemical Weapons Convention. Some people saying, well, sorry to contradict, but actually they aren't. The symptoms of lewisite sounds more like the symptoms of CN gas or CS gas. Someone else saying that that's correct. Someone saying that actually there's no evidence that they have this, that such things were destroyed previously. Absolutely correct. Also, there's no evidence whatsoever that Russia did not destroy all the old Soviet stocks of lewisite. Someone else then saying, well, actually, it's really easy to make. So that's kind of neither here nor there. Now, but I think this point is good. Like, there's no evidence, or it's a point someone else makes elsewhere on this thread, that actually just someone saying something in the car isn't good enough evidence to suggest that that is taking place. And even though you might be pro-Ukrainian and you hear something like that, and it might strike a chord and make you think, yes, the Russians are bad and they've done bad things here, we must be super critical of both sides and the claims both sides make. Just make sure that we have enough evidence to cross that threshold to make the claim the most plausible explanation of the data. The data here, of course, is just someone saying something, right? So I would be inclined not to believe this until I see evidence of video evidence of chemical weapons being used. The people with the symptoms, so on and so forth. Anyway, that's just my tuppence. In Klishchivka, well, these claims, this has just come out, so 9:27 a.m. For me, that's in the last sort of half an hour. This is near Bakhmut. We've left Klishchivka. This is from a Russian source. It is necessary to check, refuted. If it's refuted, I'll be glad. If it is true, that's bad. Bakhmut under fire control of the armed forces of Ukraine. I can't say a bad word about our guys who moved away, according to my data. This is again a shell diet. I'd be glad to be wrong. In other words, they have a lack of ammunition, possibly a lack of stuff to fire the ammunition, I would say. You won't be strong without strength. The weak don't win. The city of Bakhmut is under threat of assault. Can we keep it? Yes. Who knows? A bit of confusion there, but essentially Klishchivka might have fallen, but it might not have done. I just don't know yet. And then in the Berdyansk direction, so that this is in the Velika Novosilka salient, Ukrainian troops have advanced up to 2 kilometers in the Berdyansk direction. A military spokesperson, Shershin, said yesterday. So that is good news. Magnificent success south of Bakhmut. 2 key fortifications defend that flank. One of them has been taken. 1.5 kilometer advance. Second fortification, Klishchivka, is untenable because Ukraine has occupied the forest to the north. Rejoice at that news. Yeah, that was 20 hours ago, and that now could be could be in Ukrainian hands, as in Klishchiivka. Now, Priutne, there are some claims that Priutne, which was kind of holding out, this is this small village to the east of Levadne and to the south of Rivnopil. You've got Velika Novosilka up there, and you've got Uruzhaini and Stara Mayorska over here. They are holding out, but Priutne has possibly fallen to the has been liberated by the Ukrainians. Welcome home, says Max23 here. Previously, the settlement of Priutne came under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. So that he's saying that has just happened. And then good news filtering from the front, says Tim White. Ukraine's Tavria Brigade says it advanced 2 kilometers near Tokmak. So that would be in the Robotna area, I would have thought. Meanwhile, so I detect a note of panic from convicted terrorist Igor Strelkov, Evil Gherkin. Big moves north of Bakhmut. Let's read what he has to say in his piece here. Apparently, the enemy resumed the offensive on the Vromysky Ledge, so that's actually Velika Novosilka. Heavy fighting is reported. Alarming information comes from the area of north of Bakhmut, just where the understaffed units of the 3rd Army Corps are deployed to our side. The enemy is in that area, has an advance. How deep, I can't say. There's little information, but there urgently went reserves. Actually, I'm pretty sure that's what I said yesterday. That's what his claim was yesterday. In Zaporizhia, forward elements of the armed forces of Ukraine are rapidly advancing east and southeast of Pyatkhatki towards the settlement of Konovalova. The situation is extremely fluid and it could develop into a breakthrough. And this is that mapping is from Rebar there, so the advance towards Vasilivka might be on, or it might still be sort of hanging around Pyatkhatki, but there could well be some success for the Ukrainians there. Now, footage of the Russians trying to oust Ukrainian forces from the Dachas to the west of the Antonivsky Bridge on the left bank of the Kherson of the Dnipro in the Kherson region. Ukrainian forces managed to grab a foothold for the last week on the other side of Dnipro, while Russian forces struggle to remove them. So that is still ongoing. I haven't seen too much detail about what is going on around the Antonivsky Bridge and whether the Ukrainians have been able to expand their area of control there. But as you can see, the Russians are using that. Looks like it could be FAB 500 bomb. These guided glide bombs released by aviation. Right, moving on to geopolitical stuff now. We have Jens Stoltenberg remains Secretary General of NATO. There was talk about several people possibly replacing Jens Stoltenberg. He's coming up for being replaced, but NATO have kind of, well, I think it was, there are lots of different ideas that were floating around. So it could have been that Ben Wallace, the UK Defence Secretary, was one of the names thrown into the hat that was going to replace Jens Stoltenberg, and actually would have been a good replacement. It's been in the Nordic states, I think, for the last few Secretary Generals, and there was some claims that or some of the names to replace Jens Stoltenberg were Nordic names again, and some people were like, no, he needs to go elsewhere. But then it was, I don't know whether it's Ben Wallace himself pulling out or understanding that he wasn't probably going to get it, that he pulled out. And then Jens Stoltenberg, I think, was just a bit of a shoo-in, really, to continue that role. The Ukrainians themselves, I think, are pretty happy with that. They see him as doing a good job of uniting NATO and NATO helping out with support for Ukraine. Ukraine will be able to join NATO without the usual delay, said the head of British Foreign Ministry, James Cleverly. So he's our foreign minister. That is interesting. Ukraine will be able to join NATO without the usual delay. So that means that it could be that Ukraine do get a fast track into NATO, which a lot of people and nations have been denying will actually happen. So there is confusing rhetoric about this. I don't know whether we should take James Cleverly at his word here, because we've had Biden saying that probably won't happen. They won't be given special privileges, which you can understand because there'll be other nations wanting to join NATO. And so how do they suddenly get to jump above us? And we're doing all the right things, that kind of stuff. So it is a difficult situation. I don't know whether Ukraine will get preferential treatment in terms of joining or not. Now, to build on what I said yesterday about Unilever, which is a British-Dutch multinational kind of conglomerate, or it has loads of brands under its under its banner. So in London, near the headquarters of Unilever, activists installed a sign. Helps to finance a war with the Russian Federation in Ukraine. Unilever still does business in the Russian Federation. In 2022, the company paid $331 million in taxes there. Now, I had yesterday a little conversation with myself about, is what I do, does it matter? Like, does it have an effect? And then some people saying it was actually great. A bunch of people saying yesterday, oh, by the way, I've sent a letter or sent an email to Unilever and I've said it out like this, and some of the content of what people are saying there was absolutely spot on. It's like, yeah, brilliant, actually, yeah, good. So all I can say is, yeah, go for it, guys. Hassle these companies in a good way, in a respectful way, but give them some strong, robust hassling on social media or just direct email to them, just to let them know what you think. That indeed their activities in remaining in Russia and their payment of tax does allow Russia to continue to execute an illegal war that also involves a huge number of war crimes. Right, Belarusian transport minister has died at the age of 47. It could be natural causes, it could be not suspicious or whatever. But we have had, was it the foreign minister who was assassinated recently, just after the CTSO meeting some months ago, as a shot across the bows for Lukashenko to keep Lukashenko in line. He was assassinated by the Russians. That's pretty much accepted now. Now we have the transport minister dying. It does look a bit dodgy when two of your ministers die within a year. I mean, I can't think of the last time a serving minister in my government's died. So, two dying in a year is pretty suspicious. So anyway, they've not commented on the cause of his death, but he might have been involved in some serious defenestration. I don't know. And it seems like the Financial Times is burying the lead a bit here. The US, UK, and France, NATO's three nuclear powers, told the Kremlin they would strike its forces with conventional weapons if it used tactical nuclear arms. Now, Xi Jinping has warned Putin, he did this, I think, was it back in March, maybe, not to use nuclear against Ukraine. So I think I've talked about this throughout the war, actually. It was very early on we came to the understanding that NATO and Ukrainian allies have actually warned Russia of exactly what would happen if they used a tactical nuke. My understanding is exactly this, that they would reply with... So I don't think this is anything new, but it's kind of now coming out more officially, which is that the rest of the world wouldn't necessarily react with nuclear armaments because, that's the end of civilization as we know it. But they have the capability to basically do something like knock out the Russian fleet within a couple of days. So the entire naval fleet could be, if NATO really, really thought about it and got together, and I'm sure, they're on tenterhooks at the moment, just certain buttons need to be pressed and orders given, that NATO could absolutely hammer, say, for example, the entire Russian Black Sea Fleet or the Russian naval fleet, Arctic Fleet or whatever. There are conventional ways that NATO could absolutely cripple Russia's military force like that, really very quickly. And they've let Putin know that very clearly. So that's why Putin, and if you've got Xi Jinping as well saying China would not be happy if you turn to nukes, then I think Putin know, and this is why the red lines are now, there aren't red lines. People know he's probably not going to use nukes, and therefore that allows everyone else to have a bit of breathing room with regard to giving aid to Ukraine and crossing what were otherwise red lines, because he's not going to use nukes. The question at the moment is he going to use Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and pretend it's Ukraine? We've seen them do similar things with the Novokakhovka hydroelectric power plant and dam. So, yeah, who knows? Anyway, that's today's news. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate your support. Thank you for being such a wonderful community. And I will speak to you in the Frontline update.